The smell of my father's funeral lilies was still on my suit when I smashed a glass coffee carafe into a man's face. I wasn't a violent person. Until 10 minutes ago. Now, I'm shivering in a service tunnel under Reed Dynamics, watching a red digital clock on the wall bleed away the last 48 minutes of my life. If that timer hits 0, my father's killer walks away with everything, and my lawyer, Sarah, gets a bullet in the base of her skull. My bank accounts are frozen. The police think I'm an embezzler, and the man who just pistol-whipped me is holding a document signed by my mother. The problem? My mother has been dead for 20 years. I thought I knew who my father was, and I thought I knew how he died. I was wrong about both. But to save Sarah's life, I have to delete the only evidence that can prove it. Let me take you back to the graveyard, to the moment the first lie was shoved into my hand. The scent of damp wool and graveyard mud clung to Julian Reed's skin, a physical weight that seemed to pull at his shoulders as he steered the black SUV away from the iron gates of the cemetery. The sky over Boston was a bruised purple, heavy with the threat of a downpour that refused to break. Julian's hands were white-knuckled on the leather-wrapped steering wheel, his thumbs rhythmically pressing against the seams. In his pocket, the broken mechanical watch, his father's watch, sat cold against his thigh. He didn't need to look at it to know it was time. He reached down, his fingers finding the ridged crown, and wound it. Click, 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 12 times. The spring resisted, a tiny, mechanical ghost of a heartbeat that gave him the only sense of order he had left. The funeral had been a performance, a stage play of grief directed by the man now sitting in his father's office. Marcus Sterling had approached him at the graveside, not with a hand of cardolence, but with a manila envelope. The paper had felt unnaturally warm, as if it had been pulled straight from a laser printer seconds before being driven to the cemetery. Termination of interest, Marcus had whispered, his pale blue eyes unblinking, predatory. The board has moved on, Julian. You should too. Julian didn't go home. Home was a museum of a man who had been murdered by the very empire he built. Instead, he pulled into the cracked asphalt lot of a 24-hour coffee shop on the edge of the Seaport district. The neon sign flickered, casting a sickly blue light over the puddles. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of burnt espresso beans and lemon-scented floor wax. He found a corner booth, the vinyl cracked and taped with silver duct tape, and flipped open his laptop. His fingers danced across the keys with a frantic, desperate precision. He wasn't mourning, he was hunting. He bypassed the initial security gates, his eyes tracking lines of text that scrolled like falling rain. He needed to see the logs. He needed to see how they had done it. But as he reached for the core files, a red dialog box swallowed the screen. Access denied. He tried a secondary route, a back door he had built himself 3 years ago. Invalid user. They're scrubbing you, Julian, a gravelly voice said from the shadows of the booth. Julian didn't look up. He knew the jingle of the keys before he saw the man. Mike Davis slid into the opposite seat, his heavy ring of 50 keys clattering against the scarred wooden table. The sound was a discordant symphony of metal, a shield Mike carried against a world that had once locked him out of a burning building. Mike's face was a map of exhaustion, his eyes bloodshot behind thick glasses. "I can't get in, Mike," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. "It's like I never existed. Every password, every thumbprint, it's all gone." Mike leaned forward, the smell of stale tobacco and peppermint gum drifting from his coat. He slid a small silver thumb drive across the table. It was heavy, cold metal. I pulled the logs from the physical backup before they shut me out of the server room. Midnight, Julian. That's when it happened. While you were sitting in that chapel, someone used a master key to move every patent the Reed family owns into a blind trust. Julian took the drive, his fingers trembling. My father's patents. The clean energy tech, the water filtration. Everything? Everything, Mike confirmed, his voice a low rumble. And they didn't just steal them. They used your father's own digital signature to authorize the move. They're making it look like he gave it away before he died. Julian stared at the drive. The weight of it felt like a mountain. He wouldn't have done that. He was building a legacy for the city, not a fire sale for Sterling. He looked at the screen, the blue light reflecting in the dark circles under his eyes. I have to decrypt this. If I can show the signature was forced or timed after his heart stopped. You don't have much time, Mike warned, his hand resting on the table, fingers twitching toward his keys. Marcus has the board in his pocket. They aren't just looking the other way, they're holding the bags. Julian opened a terminal window, ready to force the drive's encryption, but the bell above the coffee shop door chimed. It wasn't the soft, melodic sound of a customer entering. It was a sharp, metallic ring that cut through the low hum of the milk steamer. Two men stepped inside. They wore charcoal tactical jackets, the kind that didn't show blood and hid the bulge of a holster. Their boots thudded against the linoleum with a heavy, synchronized rhythm. Julian froze. He recognized the man in the lead, David Thompson, a man who didn't eat anything red because it reminded him of the blood he'd seen in a ditch in Kandahar. Thompson's eyes scanned the room, landing on Julian with the clinical detachment of a butcher looking at a side of beef. Mr. Reed, Thompson said, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. Mr. Sterling would like his property back. Julian didn't think. He didn't have the bandwidth for a tactical retreat. He grabbed the heavy glass carafe of scorching black coffee from the burner beside the booth. As Thompson lunged, Julian swung. The glass shattered against the man's forearm, spraying boiling liquid and shards across his tactical vest. Thompson grunted, his face contorting not in pain, but in a sudden, violent rage as the dark liquid soaked into his pristine white shirt underneath. "The drive, Julian!" Mike shouted, shoving the table forward to pin the second attacker against the wall. Julian scrambled over the back of the booth, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't head for the front door. That was a kill box. He bolted toward the side of the shop, where a large plate glass window looked out into a narrow, trash-strewn alley. He didn't stop to look for a latch. He tucked his laptop under his arm, shielded his face with his shoulder, and dove. The glass exploded. For a second, Julian was weightless, the world a kaleidoscope of silver shards and the smell of burnt espresso. He hit the wet pavement of the alley hard, the breath leaving his lungs in a ragged gasp. Cold rain finally began to fall, stinging the cuts on his arms. He didn't wait to see if Mike was behind him. He knew Mike's limp would slow him down. He knew Mike would want him to run. He scrambled to his feet, his boots slipping on a discarded fast food wrapper. He ran toward the end of the alley, the thumb drive clutched so tightly in his hand that the metal bit into his palm. He reached the street and didn't look back until he was 3 blocks away, ducking into the recessed doorway of a closed laundromat. His breath came in jagged shudders. He reached into his pocket and found the watch. Click, click, click. He needed to hit 12. He needed the connection. On the 8th wind, his phone buzzed. It was a private number. "Julian." Mike's voice was strained, the sound of wind rushing past the microphone. "I'm clear." but you need to listen. I saw the authorization codes on the drive before I handed it to you. I'm going to prove they're fake, Mike. I'm going to burn Sterling to the ground." There was a long pause, broken only by the sound of a distant siren. "Julian, the codes aren't fake. They're tied to the board's private accounts. Marcus didn't just steal the patents. He bribed the entire board of directors using offshore accounts that were opened in your father's name. The paper trail says Arthur Reed bought the board's silence before he died." Julian felt the world tilt. The cold brick of the laundromat pressed into his spine. "No, my father was a perfectionist. He counted every step. He wouldn't leave a trail like that." "He didn't," Mike whispered. "But the data says he did. To the rest of the world, your father wasn't a victim. He was the architect of the collapse." Julian leaned his head back against the glass door, the click, click, click of the watch the only thing keeping him from screaming into the rainy Boston night. He had the evidence to save the company, but that same evidence was a suicide note for his father's soul. He was holding a grenade, and the pin was already pulled. The rain turned into a rhythmic drumming against the metal awning of the laundromat. Julian watched the reflection of a neon open sign in a puddle, the red light bleeding into the oil-slicked water. He had to move. If Thompson and his cleanup crew were on the move, the laundromat was just a glass cage. He needed a place to disappear, but the city felt like it was shrinking. He reached for his wallet, his fingers brushing the smooth leather. He needed a room, a place with a hard line, or at least a signal that wasn't being monitored by the Reed Dynamics towers that loomed over the skyline like obsidian tombstones. He walked 4 blocks to a nondescript motel, the kind of place where the carpet smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial-strength bleach. The clerk, a woman named Jennifer with a high-pitched melodic voice, smiled at him from behind a sheet of plexiglass. "I'm so sorry, honey, but we're almost full. I can get you a single in the back, though. Just need a card for the deposit." Julian handed over his sapphire-colored corporate card. Jennifer swiped it. A sharp, digital chirp echoed in the small lobby. She frowned, her maternal face clouding with a performative sympathy. "Oh, goodness. I'm so sorry. It says account frozen. Let me try it again." She swiped it 3 more times. Each time the machine shrieked. Julian felt a cold prickle of sweat break out on his neck. He tried his personal card. Denied. He tried his emergency credit line. Denied. "Is there a problem?" Jennifer asked, her voice dropping into a practiced, people-pleaser whisper. "Maybe you should call your bank? I'm so sorry for the inconvenience." Julian didn't answer. He looked past her at the small television mounted in the corner of the lobby. A local news crawl was scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Breaking. Federal authorities seeking Julian Reed for questioning in multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme at Reed Dynamics. Sources say Reed fled his father's funeral after evidence of offshore money laundering surfaced. Asterisk. His own face stared back at him. A photo from last year's annual report. He looked polished, confident, a prince of industry. Now he was a ghost in a wet wool suit. I'll be right back," Julian stammered, backing toward the door. "Sorry, so sorry," Jennifer called out to his retreating back, already reaching for the phone. He burst back out into the rain. He was a fugitive. Marcus hadn't just taken his keys, he'd taken his identity. He reached into his pocket and wound the watch. 12 times. The mechanical resistance was the only thing that felt real. He needed Sarah. Sarah Johnson was the only person who treated an apology like a debt and the law like a fortress. He found her 3 blocks away, sitting in her silver sedan outside a courthouse. She didn't look surprised to see him, But she didn't unlock the door till he tapped his father's watch against the glass. "The bank froze everything, Sarah," Julian said as he climbed into the passenger seat, his wet clothes soaking into the expensive leather. "They're framing me. They're framing my father." Sarah didn't look at him. She was staring at the dashboard, her arms crossed so tightly her knuckles were white. "I saw the news, Julian. I've already received 4 calls from the DA's office asking if I've heard from you. I told them I don't represent fugitives." "You represent the truth," Julian snapped. "Look at this." He held up the thumb drive. "Mike got the logs. The patents are gone, but the money trail? It's all tied to my father. Sterling is using his name to buy the board." Sarah finally turned, her sharp, angular bob catching the light from a street lamp. "If the money is in his name, Julian, there's no truth that saves you. There's only a paper trail that leads to a prison cell." "We file an injunction," Julian said, his words coming out in a rapid-fire staccato. "We stop the sale of the patents to the Chinese conglomerate. It happens in 48 hours. If the assets leave the country, we lose the leverage." Sarah pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose. "With what evidence? A drive that proves your father was a criminal? The court will laugh us out of the building." "Just drive," Julian pleaded. "Please, we need to get to the safe house in Cambridge. I can't be on the street." Sarah sighed, a sharp, dry sound. She shifted the car into gear. "I'm adding this to the ledger, Julian. This isn't a favor, it's a debt." As they pulled onto the Mass Pike, the rain intensified, turning the windshield into a blurred sheet of gray. Julian watched the side mirror. A pair of headlights appeared behind them, sharp, blue-white LED beams that didn't waver. A black sedan. "Sarah, don't slow down," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave. "I'm going the speed limit, Julian. I don't need a ticket on top of..." The impact was sudden and violent. The black sedan slammed into their rear bumper, the sound of grinding metal echoing through the cabin. Sarah's head snapped forward, her glasses flying off her face. The car fishtailed, the tires screaming against the wet asphalt. "They're trying to push us off the road," Julian yelled. He reached over, grabbing the steering wheel as Sarah struggled to regain her bearings. The black sedan pulled alongside them. Julian saw the driver, David Thompson. His face was a mask of cold intensity, his hands steady on the wheel. He jerked the sedan to the right, slamming into Sarah's door. The glass shattered, a spray of diamonds coating the interior. Sarah cried out, her hands flying to her face. "I've got it! I've got it!" Julian steered the car toward the center lane, his eyes locked on the road ahead. He could feel the vibration of the engine through the floorboards, a frantic hum that matched his own pulse. "The drive!" Sarah gasped, her voice thick with panic. "Julian, the drive!" Julian reached into his pocket, making sure the metal was still there. "I have it. Hold on." He saw an exit ramp approaching, a sharp, curving turn that led toward a series of industrial warehouses. He waited until the last possible second, then yanked the wheel. The tires gripped the wet pavement for a heartbeat before sliding. The car hopped the curb, the suspension groaning as they bounced over a patch of grass and onto the access road. The black sedan missed the turn, its brakes shrieking as it skidded past. Julian didn't wait to see if they turned around. He drove the damaged car into the mouth of a multi-level parking garage, the concrete walls swallowing the sound of the rain. He spiraled up to the 4th floor, the tires echoing like gunshots in the empty space. He killed the lights and steered the car into a dark corner behind a massive concrete pillar. For a moment, there was only the sound of their breathing and the rhythmic plink of water dripping from a leaky pipe somewhere in the darkness. "Are you okay?" Julian asked, his voice trembling. Sarah sat back, her chest heaving. She reached down and found her glasses on the floor mat. One lens was cracked. I'm breathing. That's the only variable that matters right now. She looked at the shattered window, then at Julian. They aren't trying to arrest you, Julian. They're trying to delete you. Julian opened his laptop, the screen's sterile blue glow illuminating the glass shards on his lap. He plugged in the drive. He needed to find something, anything, that wasn't a bribe. He opened the folder containing the bribe authorizations. There were 12 of them, each bearing his father's elegant, flowing signature. He zoomed in on the first one, then the second. On the third document, he stopped. "Look at this," Julian whispered. Sarah leaned in, her shoulder pressing against his. "It's a signature, Julian. Looks just like the others." "No," Julian said, his finger tracing a tiny, dark smudge at the tail of the R in Reed. "My father was a perfectionist. He counted his steps. He wound his watch. He never, ever smudged his ink. Except once." Julian felt a lump form in his throat. "When I was 10, I got lost in the woods behind our house. My father found me, but he was so angry he couldn't speak. He sat me down and made me sign a contract promising I'd never leave the yard without a compass. He smudged the ink on his name. He told me, 'Julian, if you ever see a Reed name with a mark like this, it means the person who wrote it wasn't thinking clearly. It means they were afraid.'" He scrolled through the other documents. Every single signature had the same microscopic smudge. It wasn't a mistake. It was a distress code. He was being coerced. Sarah breathed. He knew someone would look. He knew you would look. "He wasn't a criminal," Julian said, the weight in his chest finally beginning to lift. "He was a prisoner." But the relief was short-lived. A heavy thud echoed from the stairwell door at the far end of the garage. Julian closed the laptop and tucked it under his arm. "We have to go," he said. "They're here." They slipped out of the car, their footsteps silent on the oil-stained concrete. They reached the stairwell just as the door below them creaked open. Julian led the way down, his hand sliding along the cold metal railing. He could hear the heavy, rhythmic tread of boots coming up. They reached the second-floor landing when the door burst open. It wasn't Thompson. It was a man in a cheap, ill-fitting suit. A process server Julian recognized from the firm's legal department. But he wasn't carrying papers. He pulled a telescopic metal baton from his belt, the shink of the expanding metal echoing in the narrow space. "Mr. Reed," the man panted, his upper lip sweating. "You're making this very difficult." He lunged, the baton whistling through the air. Julian swung his heavy leather briefcase, the metal corner catching the man's wrist. The baton clattered to the floor. Julian didn't stop. He drove his shoulder into the man's chest, pinning him against the heavy fire door. The man reached for a pair of handcuffs on his belt, his eyes darting toward the exit sign. Julian grabbed the man's arm and shoved it into the gap between the door and the frame. He slammed the door shut, the heavy steel biting into the man's forearm. A sharp cry of pain filled the stairwell. Julian didn't look back. He reached into the man's pocket and pulled out a burner phone. "Sarah, let's go." They ran out the ground floor exit and into the rainy street, disappearing into the maze of gray stone and low clouds. Julian flipped open the burner phone as they walked. There was only one number in the recent calls. "It's Sterling," Julian said, staring at the screen. "He's tracking the cleanup in real time." He opened the messages. There was an image file sent 10 minutes ago. Julian opened it and felt his heart stop. It was a scan of a corporate ledger, a document Mike hadn't found. "Sarah, look at the primary shareholder for Sterling Alpha, Sarah leaned over, her eyes widening behind her cracked glasses. Eleanor Reed. Julian, that's your mother's name. My mother died when I was 6, Julian whispered, the cold rain soaking through his shirt. But according to this, she's the one who owns the company that's buying the patents. This isn't just a corporate hit, it's a family execution. The signal on the burner phone pulsed, a blue dot moving toward the Reed Dynamics headquarters. Julian looked up at the looming tower in the distance. The truth wasn't in the logs. It was in the building. And he had exactly 4 hours to get inside before the world forgot the name Reed forever. The service tunnel was a ribcage of rusted iron and weeping brick, a subterranean vein that ran beneath the heart of Boston. Julian moved through the knee-deep, oily water, the smell of raw sewage and ozone thick enough to coat the back of his throat. Behind him, Sarah held a small flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal the slick, black moss clinging to the walls. My father used to bring me here, Julian whispered, his voice echoing in the narrow space. He told me the city was built on secrets, and if you knew the tunnels, you could never be trapped. He was a man of many metaphors, Sarah replied, her voice tight. She was holding her breath, her hand pressed against the damp wall for balance. I hope one of them includes a way to bypass a biometric lock with a half-dead laptop. They reached a heavy iron hatch, the surface bubbled with decades of corrosion. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring of vintage master keys, a gift from Mike Davis years ago. He fumbled with the lock, his fingers numb from the cold. Click, click, click. He wound his watch with his free hand, 12 times. The rhythm gave him the focus he needed. The lock groaned and gave way. Julian heaved the hatch open, the smell of filtered air and floor wax rushing out to meet them. They were in the sub-basement of Reed Dynamics. They moved with a practiced silence, navigating the maze of service corridors until they reached the heart of the beast, the server room. The air here was freezing, a dry artificial cold that made every breath an icy sting. The hum of the machines was a physical vibration, a low-frequency scream that rattled Julian's teeth. There, Julian pointed to the central hub. If I can get into the primary mainframe, I can trigger a scorched earth protocol. It won't just stop the transfer, it will delete the patents entirely. If Sterling can't sell them, he has no reason to keep us alive. He sat on the floor, his fingers flying across the keys. He felt a surge of hope as he bypassed the first layer of encryption. The progress bar appeared on the screen, a thin blue line creeping toward the right. 10%, 20%. We're doing it, Julian whispered. Sarah, watch the feed. Sarah stood by the door, her eyes locked on a small monitor showing the security cameras. The hallway's clear. Wait, the elevator's moving. Someone's coming down from the penthouse. 30%, 40%. Julian's pulse quickened. Just a few more minutes. If I can hit 60, the deletion becomes irreversible. 50%. Subverted beat 3.2. Julian watched the progress bar with a desperate, mounting intensity. This was the logical play, the only way to strip Marcus of his prize. By triggering the scorched earth protocol, Julian wasn't just defending, he was destroying the value of the theft. He'd spent years studying these fail-safes. His father had designed them specifically to prevent a hostile takeover from stripping the company's intellectual soul. 55%, Julian muttered, his eyes wide. Come on, come on. The blue bars surged. He felt a rare, sharp spark of victory. This was the moment he outsmarted the man who had stolen his life. He could almost see the look on Sterling's face when the billion-dollar assets turned into lines of zeros. Sarah looked back at him, a small, genuine smile breaking through her usual mask of professional detachment. "You've got him, Julian. He's losing his leverage." The bar hit 60%. A green chime echoed through the silent, freezing room. Protocol initiated. Julian let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. His shoulders dropped, and for the first time in days, the tension in his neck began to uncoil. He had won. The patents were being scrubbed from every server in the global network. Then the chime changed. It wasn't a success tone. It was a sharp, discordant wail that vibrated through the floorboards. The green text on the screen turned a violent, pulsing red. "Secondary protocol activated. Asset protection lockdown." Julian's fingers froze. What? No, that's not right. The deletion should be autonomous. He tried to override the command, but the keyboard was dead. A message scrolled across the screen in a font Julian had never seen. Internal theft detected. Physical sealing initiated. "Julian, what's happening?" Sarah's voice was sharp with alarm. He looked up. The heavy, reinforced blast doors at the end of the room were sliding shut with a hiss of pneumatic pressure. The lights flickered, then shifted to a deep, bloody crimson. The deletion. It wasn't a failsafe, Julian whispered, his face pale in the red light. It was a trap. Sterling modified the code. He knew I'd try to burn the house down, so he linked the deletion command to a building-wide alert. The truth hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. He hadn't just failed to stop the transfer. He had signaled his exact location to every security guard in the building. He had locked himself into a windowless, soundproof vault with no way out. He had been so focused on being smart that he'd walked directly into the center of a cage Sterling had built just for him. "Julian!" Sarah screamed. The elevator doors at the far end of the room opened. Marcus Sterling stepped out, a heavy silver pistol held casually at his side. He wasn't wearing a suit anymore. He was in a dark tactical sweater, looking more like a commando than a CEO. Behind him, David Thompson and two other guards followed, their boots echoing on the raised metal floor. "I have to hand it to you, Julian," Marcus said, his voice a low, predatory drawl. "You really are your father's son. You always did have a flair for the dramatic." Marcus walked toward them, the rhythmic clink-catch of his silver coin echoing in the red-lit room. He didn't look angry. He looked bored. He reached Julian and, without a word, swung the heavy pistol. The metal barrel caught Julian across the temple, sending him sprawling against a server rack. Julian's vision blurred. He felt the warm copper tang of blood in his mouth. He looked up to see Marcus holding the pistol to Sarah's head. "The deletion stopped at 62%, Julian," Marcus said, his eyes unblinking. "That's enough to cause a headache, but not enough to kill the deal. Now, you're going to sit at that terminal and you're going to reverse it. And then you're going to give me the master key to the moral integrity clause." I can't," Julian wheezed. Marcus pressed the barrel of the gun harder into Sarah's temple. "Your father was a perfectionist, Julian. He counted his steps. He wound his watch. But he forgot one thing. People don't follow the math. They follow the pain." Marcus leaned down, his face inches from Julian's. "I killed him, you know. It was remarkably easy. He was so obsessed with his heart health that he never noticed when his daily pills were replaced with a placebo. He died counting the stairs to his office. 1, 2, 3. And then his heart just gave up. It was a perfect, silent execution." Julian felt a scream building in his throat. But he looked at Sarah. Her eyes were wide, filled with a terror she couldn't hide. He looked at the screen. He looked at the man who had murdered his father. "I'll do it," Julian whispered. "Just let her go." "Reverse it," Marcus commanded. Julian's fingers moved across the keys, but they felt like lead. He watched as the evidence of the fraud, the logs of the midnight transfer, and the record of the bribes vanished. He was erasing the only proof he had. He was murdering his father's legacy with his own hands. When the screen went black, Marcus nodded. "Take them to the holding room," Marcus said, turning away. "I have a board meeting to attend. And Julian, don't bother winding the watch. The time for ghosts is over." The holding room was a concrete box in the bowels of the building, a place where the hum of the servers was replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Julian sat on the floor, his head between his knees, the copper taste of blood still fresh on his tongue. Sarah sat opposite him, her arms wrapped around her legs, staring at the blank steel door. "He's going to kill us, Julian," she said, her voice a flat, hollow whisper. "As soon as that vote is finalized, we're just loose ends." Julian didn't answer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the watch. He didn't wind it. He just held it, the cold metal a reminder of everything he had lost. He looked around the room. It was empty, save for a single flickering floor lamp in the corner. He stood up, his legs shaking. He walked over to the lamp and kicked it. The base cracked, revealing a tangle of copper wiring. "Julian, what are you doing?" "My father designed this building," Julian said, his voice regaining a sliver of its staccato precision. He was terrified of being trapped. He built in a fail-secure flaw in the old electronic locks. If you introduce a high-voltage surge to the secondary circuit, the magnets lose their grip for exactly 3 seconds. He stripped the wires with his teeth, the metallic taste of copper mixing with the blood. He took a deep breath and jammed the wires into the electronic keypad by the door. A shower of sparks erupted, the smell of ozone filling the small room. The lights died. For a heartbeat, the room was pitch black. Then, a heavy thunk echoed through the door. Julian shoved. The door swung open. "Go," he whispered. "Get to the harbor. Find Mike." "What about you?" Sarah asked, grabbing his arm. "I'm going to the boardroom," Julian said, his eyes hard. "I'm not leaving until the math checks out." He ran up the service stairs, his lungs burning. He reached the top floor just as the double mahogany doors of the boardroom were being closed by 2 guards. He didn't slow down. He put his shoulder into the wood and burst inside. The room was a vacuum of personality. 12 men and women sitting around a massive table that looked like a tombstone. Marcus Sterling sat at the head, a champagne flute in his hand. "Julian." Marcus sighed, not even looking up. "You really are a glutton for punishment. Guards, wait!" Julian shouted, his voice cracking. "Look at the charter, the original charter on the table." The board members paused, their eyes darting between Julian and Marcus. In the center of the table sat the original founding document of Reed Dynamics, a piece of parchment that was over 30 years old. "My father didn't just design buildings," Julian panted, walking toward the table. "He designed systems. He knew that one day, someone like you would try to forge his name." He reached out and touched the signature on the charter. "This is smart ink. It's a chemical compound that reacts to the biometric scan of the person who signed it. If the document is ever moved from the vault without a Reed biometric, the ink changes color." As they watched, the deep black ink of Arthur Reed's signature began to glow a faint, sickly green. The signatures on the transfer papers were black, weren't they? Julian looked at the board members. Because they were forgeries. Marcus didn't have the biometric. He had a printer. Julian turned to Marcus. who was now standing, his face contorted in a mask of silent fury. And the shareholder? Elena Reed? My mother's middle name wasn't Elena. It was Elizabeth. You didn't even bother to check the birth certificate, Marcus. You were so busy playing the long game that you forgot the details. The room was silent. Then, Robert Miller, the portly man who always sat by the door, stood up. His upper lip was sweating, and he was chewing an antacid with a frantic, chalky sound. "Is this true, Marcus?" Miller stammered. "The signatures, the racketeering. We were told this was a legal acquisition. Sit down, Robert." Marcus hissed. "No," Julian said, leaning over the table. "If you vote for this sale, you aren't just selling a company. You're becoming accomplices to murder. Marcus swapped my father's medication. He told me himself." The board members looked at each other. The fear in the room was palpable, a thick, suffocating cloud. One by one, they began to stand. "Call the authorities," Jennifer Wilson whispered, her maternal face pale. "I'm so sorry, Marcus. I'm so sorry." Marcus lunged for the gun on the table. But David Thompson, the man who hated the color red, stepped forward and caught his wrist. Thompson looked at the blood on Julian's face, then at the green ink on the paper. "The mission is over, Mr. Sterling," Thompson said, his voice flat. He twisted Marcus's arm behind his back with a sickening pop. Julian watched in silence as the police arrived, the blue and red lights reflecting in the glass walls of the boardroom. Marcus was led away in handcuffs, his silver coin falling to the floor with a hollow clink. Julian didn't follow them. He sat in his father's old chair at the head of the table. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the watch. He wound it. 12 times. Click, click, click. The spring didn't resist this time. It turned smoothly, a soft, mechanical hum filling the quiet room. A week later, Julian stood at the edge of the Boston harbor. The air was freezing, a biting, salt-heavy wind cutting through his coat. He looked out at the black water, the red buoy bobbing silently in the distance. He had announced the restructuring that morning. Reed Dynamics wouldn't be a kingdom anymore. It would be a cooperative, owned by the people who built the tech, the people who kept the lights on. It was what his father would have wanted, if he hadn't been so busy counting the steps. Julian pulled the watch from his pocket. He looked at it one last time, then tossed it into the water. It disappeared without a ripple, swallowed by the infinite void of the harbor. He took a deep breath, the salty air filling his lungs. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to count. He didn't feel the need to wind. He just stood there, a man no longer defined by a ghost, watching the sun break through the gray Boston clouds. The silence was finally enough.